Hello everyone, welcome back, and I'm going to carry on talking a bit about the establishment of Northern Ireland, partition, and particularly talk just quite briefly about the so-called Partition Election of 1921. It's not really called that. This is essentially the election now for the Parliament of Northern Ireland, this new Parliament that's been established by the Government of Ireland Act. And I'll just refresh your memory about the Government of Ireland Act if I can. And there it is there, just to give you an idea. So we're going to have two elections now, for a Northern Parliament and a Southern Parliament, for this new, devolved governments. And that's essentially what the partition election is called. Now we'll see the Southern election doesn't really take place, but we'll talk about that in a second. And, it's kind of odd this, when you think about the history of Home Rule in Ireland, in the, in 1886, in 1893, 1912 to 14, all these times where you have a Home Rule bill put forward, they'd always founded on Unionist opposition. But in 1920, you've got to a situation where you've finally reached a settlement that satisfies Ulster Unionists, but not Irish nationalists. And you're in a strange position now. So it's almost the opposite has kind of happened. Now, I say Northern Ireland is where the focus is going to be, because ultimately what's going to happen is Northern Ireland is the only place where this Government of Ireland Act is actually going to function. In the south, as we'll see, they're not even going to acknowledge this act exists, and they're going to end up negotiating their own settlement in the shape of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But that's obviously another story. Now, this new Northern Ireland, of course, that's going to be established, has some big hurdles that it has to overcome when you think about it. I mean, one obvious thing is going to be security, and we'll talk in a whole separate lecture about security, because it certainly is, for the first 2 years of its existence, going to be challenged from within and without. So from its own Catholic minority inside, and externally from Southern nationalists. This state is going to go through cataclysmic levels of violence, really. I mean, violence that's equivalent or even worse to the violence that we get in the Troubles. In the early 1970s, really the worst kind of period. But again, we'll talk about that. So the response of this state very early on a lot of it is about survival. And you do get the creation of a vast, rather alarmist, partisan security apparatus. And we'll see the history of Northern Ireland, and I think you could characterise the history of Northern Ireland generally in that it remains in a almost permanent state of emergency throughout its whole existence, really. It's paranoid now. And it's a lot to do with the trauma of its birth and the violence that its birth. So security is one big challenge it faces. A second point, of course, to make is, I suppose, the basic issue of state building. Remember, you're building here, amidst this violence we're going to talk about, a state from scratch. Dublin has always been, as it were, the ceremonial capital of Ireland, and it's the place where all the admin is and the ministries and so on. You haven't got any of that in Belfast. You've got to build all these things up from the ground. And one of the issues about state building in Northern Ireland is there's a kind of ideological deficit. And what I mean by that is, the Irish nationalists have always been pushing for Home Rule, devolved power at Parliament in Dublin. And you can imagine when they get one, it's all very exciting because they've been making these plans, their aspirations have been achieved, and there's dynamism and there's all these things going on. Let's build this, build that. And in Northern Ireland, of course, their whole shtick has been anti-Home Rule. We don't want Home Rule. But now we're being kind of forced to take it. Okay, we'll compromise and we'll take it. So there's no great energy in terms of wanting to build a state and wanting to build state institutions and so on. And that's going to be a problem. Trying to do this while you're in the middle of a virtual civil war is also going to be an issue. A third issue, I suppose you'd have to say for Northern Ireland is the nature of the relationship with Britain. Now, as we said, Britain, this support that we have from the British establishment pre-First World War has now very much dissipated. The Tories are back in power. And there certainly is a growing sense, as we'll see, that the British can't be relied on. That, you have to look over your shoulder, as it were, as well as watching what nationalists are doing within your state or Southern nationalists are doing outside your state. So a real sense of classic kind of siege now is what you're going to get. It's not a very healthy start, I think, is the point about this. So, you know, I say they have accepted this parliament as a compromise. I mean, one of the main reasons, of course, they do this is they think, well, hang on, it's okay now we've got a conservative dominated government in charge, but what happens in the future if we're under direct rule and some Labour or Liberal government or whatever comes in? They could just give us away. At least they could give us a kind of protection having a parliament in Dublin. But you'll see it's kind of, sorry, in Belfast, but you'll see it's rather negative. It's it's about defending the state. It's not about, there's no positive idea or aspirations to build the state. It's about another way to help defend ourselves, to hold the siege in place. So I'd say they're just some things to bear in mind as we go through about some of the problems that Northern Ireland's going to face. Now, I'd say the main thing I want to talk about today is the obvious first step in terms of putting the Government of Ireland Act into operation is going to be elections. And then you have elections, you have new parliaments, and you have a new parliament, and then you can form a government and ministries, and off we go then. So that's going to be the first step. And these are due to be held in the spring of 1921. Now the problem is with Sinn Féin is Sinn Féin has no intention of playing ball with this. It doesn't have anything to do with the act at all. And what they in fact do, Sinn Féin, is they use the mechanisms of the election, as it were the money and the whole administrative framework that's set up for the creation of this thing called Southern Ireland. They use it merely to elect a second revolutionary Doyle in an uncontested election. So they haven't, they're not interested. They have declared their independence. They believe they're fighting for this independent republic, which they've declared, back in 1919. And I mean, I suppose when you look at one way we could be critical of Sinn Féin, and I think a number of people have been critical of Sinn Féin, is that while all these discussions are going on in the Government of Ireland Act, and as we said, it takes a year to go through Parliament, so there's a lot of back and forth. There are virtually no Irish nationalist MPs there. You only got a few in there who are the remnants of the Home Rule Party. But the 73 Sinn Féin MPs, of course, are off in Dublin. Now, some people have argued that this is the problem with abstention, that if they had been in there weighing in as a bloc, arguing the point, saying, no, we want more firmer minority protections. No, the border can't be there. We want, there's huge Catholic communities in South Armagh or whatever. We need the border to be here. And they could really have, perhaps maybe compromised the partition solution if they wanted to, or at least if they were acting more positively, they could have at least made the protections for the Catholic minority more sound, copper fastened them. And we wouldn't end up with what we ended up with, of course, in Northern Ireland now for 50 years of Northern Catholics as second-class citizens, and if we had these protections, if they had a nationalist voice in Parliament to, as it were, protect them, rather than just these lone individuals. So that could be a way of being critical of Sinn Féin. I think, again, some people have made that point. But back to the elections. So the elections in Northern Ireland are going to take place in May. As I say, they're a non-event in the south. And perhaps that is an advantage in the sense that Sinn Féin now can turn their formidable propaganda machine to face the north, because that's the only election they're actually contesting. And the Sinn Féin itself and the Nationalist Party, which is what we're now calling the Home Rule Party, the remnants of that Joe Devlin, they are going to organise a pact, an electoral pact. So that's good. They're not going to go against each other. If there's a chance of a unionist sneaking in one of these constituencies, they're going to balance out the representation. So that's good. And the election itself is going to be held under proportional representation. So 52 seats are up for grabs. So you think this kind of looks good for nationalists, Sinn Féin and the Nationalist Party. And certainly it's true that Sinn Féin pour huge amounts of effort into this election to the first Northern Irish Parliament. Huge propaganda campaign, take out full-page adverts and stuff in newspapers. They publish their own newspaper, in fact, a newspaper called the Unionist. which they distribute then to prominent unionists in East Ulster. The trouble with the Sinn Féin campaign is its tone. And I think we have to be critical here of this. And I think there's a link in the reading to an article by Kiko Nui, who writes wonderfully about this. It's very arrogant. And so they don't try and woo Northern Unionists. They don't try and mollify them. They stand up basically saying, we're going to tell you how wrong you all are. And very preachy. I'll give you a quote here. This is a quote from Louis Walsh, who's the prominent Northern Sinn Féiner. And he argues, writing to a colleague, he says this: Ulster has never really had the truth preached to her. And having regard to the obstacle she is in our way, I do think that you should concentrate on the problem of her enlightenment. And this is a fundamental problem, you can argue, with Irish nationalism, Irish republicanism particularly, throughout all of its history, that it doesn't accept unionist opposition as authentic. And again, often all nationalists kind of do this, in history. If you don't agree with them, you're somehow being misled, or you're brainwashed, or you're foreign anyway. You're not kind of part of the body politic or ethnic group or whatever. And I say you have a lot of this kind of preaching from Irish nationalists, rather than dealing with the simple fact, which I don't think Republicans have ever dealt with, that there are 1 million unionists in Ulster who have no interest at all in your project and your ideas, completely reject it. You have to deal with them, Now, of course, the focus will always be on the British and get the Brits out and so on. If you get rid of the Brits out, then everything is going to be wonderful and tickety-boo. That's just fanciful. Absolutely not. So they never actually deal with unionists as an authentic group of people who need persuasion. They don't persuade them, they preach to them. And throughout the period, Northern Ireland will be referred to derisively, as Carsonia or Ulsteria. And even today, the north of Ireland or the 6 counties, we will not utter the apocryphal phrase Northern Ireland and so on. So, and what you get with Southern nationalism is they slip into denial. That's what they sit, and they stick on their high horse. And here's a great quote here. This is a quote from a nationalist newspaper. You can see here, there is no such political entity as Ulster. It is not Sir Edward Carson, but the government of Britain, which incited and secretly incites a minority in the northeast of Ireland to oppose the Republic. The so-called Ulster question has neither its roots nor its origin in Ulster. Its root and origin are British, and with the disappearance of British government, it will also automatically disappear. That is a deeply held Republican belief, and I would contend it is wrong, wrong, wrong. You have to deal with the fact that it is authentic, it is real. You might not like it, absolutely, that's another issue, but it is something you have to actually deal with. So this, I say, that's one problem that you get right throughout Republican history, and it rears its head again during this election, May 1921. So rather than go to Unionists and say, we're all Irish together, and we're not a threat, we're not dangerous, and try and preach to them, whatever, they don't do that at all. Lots of spouting off, and I'll give you an example. Here's a quote from a Sinn Féiner standing up in Armagh during the election campaign, and he says, "The man who claimed to have common sense and voted against independence should go at once to the nearest lunatic asylum and find out what was wrong with him." Yeah, that's fine. Now that'll work with Irish nationalists, of course. That's fine. They'll probably lap all that up, but it's not going to help you win the hearts and minds, as it were, of unionists. And Eamon Donnelly, who is the Sinn Féin's chief organiser in Ulster, writes a letter on the day of the poll itself. And what he says is very telling. I think it kind of backs up what I've been saying. The only effect, he says, that all our literature and leaflets will have or have had upon unionists is to bring them out to vote against us in even greater numbers. And that is so true, because here are the election results, as you can see now, for the first election to an All-Irish Parliament, 24th of May 1921, and there are the results. And look at what it tells us. Every single unionist who stood is elected. 40 of them elected. only 12 seats now are divided between Sinn Féin and the Home Rule Party, the Nationalist Party. That's even with the Electoral Pact. And what it shows, interestingly enough, because it doesn't really make sense, it is proportional, this, and you're still talking about, 30-odd% of the population being Catholic, being nationalist. And what we've actually got here, if you look deeply into the details, is evidence that in some places Northern Catholics don't want to vote for Sinn Féin. So it's almost like that animosity that we've already mentioned when Sinn Féin were on the rise, and the way that the Home Rulers and the Northern Catholics did not really vote for Sinn Féin. They never really support Sinn Féin. The Nationalist Party will remain very, very powerful and prominent. That kind of rears its ugly head again in North. So the division seems to be between brands of nationalism, as it were, rather than a united nationalist front against Unionists. So this is a crushing blow. A massive mandate now for James Craig, a massive mandate now for the Parliament of Northern Ireland. And here is the first meeting, which is held less than a month now after the elections. As you can see, 7th of June. They meet in the council chamber of Belfast City Hall. Of course, Stormont isn't built yet. Stormont won't be built until the 1930s. It will have various homes, this Parliament. It will move around to the Union Theological College at Queen's University and various places before it finds its permanent home at Stormont. But here is the meeting. And this first session, when it's opening, of course, the big moment comes with the visit of the King. And the King's going to come now to formally open this Parliament shortly afterwards. Huge scenes of celebration now on the streets of Belfast. And when the King arrives, the King's only going to come over for one day. It is quite funny, actually. I'll show you actually a picture of the King's visit. Yeah, so there is the King visiting. Only comes for one day with the Queen to open this up, and then goes off on his yacht again the same day. It's quite funny, actually. James Craig is terrified that he's going to be assassinated. His wife tells us this in a diary. God, comes in after they thank God that's over. Has a big scotch. Oh God, he survived. Got rid of him now. That's good. But it's a big day of celebration. And I think what that tells us, of course, is... So Northern Ireland's up and running. It's definitely up and running. Now, of course, what does the King do when he's here? Now, this is very important. Certainly when we're going to talk about back to the War of Independence. He makes a speech, the King, and in that speech, written for him by Lloyd George, he calls for an end to the conflict in Ireland, the War of Independence. He calls for a truce. He calls for negotiation. It's a very conciliatory speech. And, almost, 2 weeks later or so, we are absolutely going to get that. We're going to get now a truce and the War of Independence coming to an end and a negotiation. And I say that tells us really what the British plan is. Get Northern Ireland up and running. And then once it's all done, all that's done, Parliament, King's there, then you move on to the south and you appease now Southern nationalists and start to negotiate with them. That, I think, is what's going on here. Now, I say, just to mention something we'll talk about next time, which is, I mentioned the fact that James Craig is worried the King's going to be assassinated. Now, why is that the case? Well, just to go back a bit on our story, it's because in 1920, in the summer of 1920, what had been previously quiescent Ulster has erupted in violence. And we're going to talk about that next time. A period which begins, this appears almost right in the middle of the 2-year period, running roughly from July 1920 to June 1922. We are going to have these cataclysmic levels of violence now in the north, getting worse and worse and worse, particularly in the city of Belfast, but also all over the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. So this is happening, this Northern Irish Parliament being established amidst escalating violence and instability. It's not a great way for a new state to come into existence, with snipers in every window and so on, and to protect the various dignitaries and so on. So what we'll do is next time we'll talk about this violence and how violence, the character of violence that comes to Ulster, why it comes to Ulster when it does. Ulster's been incredibly quiet. So then the War of Independence in the South, all this is going on. So almost nothing happens in Ulster, which is kind of remarkable when you think about the tension from the Ulster crisis. You'd imagine this was a real kind of hotbed where there was going to be, if there's going to be a spark, it's going to happen here. But it doesn't happen. A long wait until July 1920, and it's only then when it all erupts. And boy, does it erupt then. And I say, will be the constant background noise now, this violence, to all these changes constitutionally, all these negotiations and so on that are going to go on for the next 2 years. Okay, everyone, so I'll speak to you again very soon. Take care.